Mr. Speaker, thank you, and to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Herodopoulos, thank you so much. I rise today to discuss or to comment on what I see as the biggest fraud this body has ever put upon the American people. Let's go back to the beginning of the Unaffordable Care Act, Obamacare. How was this sold to the American people? You can keep your doctor if you like it. You can keep your plan. Your insurance premiums are going to go down. And I'll tell you, all of that, this is one time that both the Republicans and Democrats agree it did not deliver on that. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, has been one of the biggest drivers in increasing not just the cost of health insurance, but the cost of health care. And to continue this deception, it was clear that this plan would not work. You don't have to be a PhD in mathematics to understand why. As you start to add things, the essential health benefits that you added onto these policies, these required benefits, as you started to add things that had to be covered, and I'm not saying whether those were good or bad, but you add expenses, you can't make prices go down. It'd be like saying if you went to a fast food restaurant and ordered a soda and the price is going to go down, but they have to give you a free cheeseburger as well. It just doesn't make common sense, doesn't make mathematical sense. And so to further this deception, they realized that it only worked by subsidizing it. So you had to levy a tax to subsidize it. And the architects, on the other side of the aisle who put this together realized that the American people would rebel against this if they were given a tax to pay for it. So how did they hide that? Well, let's just tax the payers. Let's tax the insurance companies, and then they can pass those expenses down to the American people through higher premiums. And that's exactly what happened. And so then let's look at another phenomenon. As these prices start going up, people start to question whether they're getting value for what they're paying for. And for some folks, the answer was no. They didn't want to pay those higher rates. And so some folks came off. And as we see, the people who come off tend to be the people who least need services. So the healthy, younger people tend to be the ones that come off. And as they do that, that concentrates the risk. That makes the prices go higher for the insurance companies, for the payers. And so as that happens and you get into the next policy year, they have to raise the rates again. And as they raise the rates again, you lose more subscribers to those policies. And so you further concentrate the risk. And this is known as adverse selection. And so what happens in adverse selection, every time you see that raise, those prices rise, you start to see more people come off. They look for alternatives like healthcare sharing ministries, they look for something else, or they go uninsured. And you start this endless cycle of these prices going up. One other thing I just want to point out, this is kind of economics 101. The more money you put into a system, the more expensive things get. And we've seen that in so many different areas. We've seen that in subprime lending. We've seen that in student loans. We've seen that in so many. You put money into a system, and it starts to push prices up. And one of the other contributors we have is not just adverse selection that is concentrating the risk and making it more expensive for the insurance companies, but we put so much money into the system that we're seeing rises in actual health care. And it's important to make the distinction between the rising costs of health care and the related rising costs in health insurance. And so we've just come to this, death spiral of this becoming more and more and more unaffordable. And in my personal opinion, this entire system is going to collapse under its own weight, and you've got, two solutions. The other side thinks that we should just write a blank check from the federal government, no matter how big that check is going to be, so that we can hide the fact that this is failing. I mean, let's face it, this is this is seen as a landmark piece of legislation that the Democrats have pushed over the last couple of decades. It's important to them to protect this landmark legislation. And I'm sorry, the emperor's not wearing clothes, and in order to hide that, they're doing these smoke screens with these increased subsidies. So now let's look at the subsidies that have really gotten a lot of attention, these Obamacare subsidies that we've been talking about that the Democrats brought in response to COVID. So these are subsidies to folks that are on the individual market. Now, it's important to note that the individual market is a small percentage of the insureds. This is not the entire market. This is not small group. This is not large group. This is a small percentage of folks that are on the individual marketplace that get their health insurance through healthcare.gov or through one of the exchanges. So it's a very small part. And when the Democrats first put this, it was in reaction to the chaos during COVID, and it was by their intent and by their architecture, it was a temporary solution for a temporary problem. So it was designed to expire. It had a sunset. And then when it was coming up to a sunset, when the Democrats still had control and had the ability to make this permanent, they still put an expiration date on it. So these enhanced premium tax credits, or these Obamacare credits, were designed to expire at the end of this year. So essentially January 1st is when they were designed to expire. And that was entirely policy brought by the Democrats. This was not a Republican policy. So this smokescreen that there are estimates between $300 and $400 billion to pay for it over the next 10 years, if they are expanded, like I said, are a smokescreen. And as folks start talking about whether prices are going to go up or go down or what these subsidies do, let's talk about that for a second. Because these subsidies are a very small part of the increases that we're seeing in premiums because of what I've already talked about, because of rising costs of health care, and because of rising costs of health insurance that are due to those health care increases as well as that adverse selection. And so this small percentage, let me just put it in perspective. In Montana, we've got a number of payers, a number of insurance companies, but the one with the largest increase on the individual market was about 25%. It's a high number, I agree. But that 25%, it was a single-digit amount. It was about 9% of that was attributed to the enhanced premium tax credits, to the Obamacare credits. So even without that, the price is going up. And independent of these Obamacare credits that we're discussing, it's going up in the small group, the large group. It's going up in every other part of insurance. So that part without the enhanced premium, so I said that delta between 25 and 9. So let's say that's 16%. Everybody else is still seeing that. They're still seeing that increase. One of the smallest increases we saw from our major payers, was about 10, a little bit over a 10%. And it was about 3 or 4% of that was attributed to the Obamacare premiums. And the reason I'm bringing this up is it's a very small percentage of this overall costs. And one thing that I want to point out is if these tax credits are allowed to expire on the 31st, premiums are going up. If we extend them, premiums are going up. It's happening either way. And just one thing I want to end on, just so that people understand, how this process works, is if this body decides to extend those premiums, let's say it's for 2 years or 3 years, arbitrary amount, what happens? The way that insurance rates are filed is they go to the states, the payers, the insurance companies bring them to the state, they file, they're approved, they get filed with CMS, with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then the open enrollment period starts, which is usually mid-November to mid-December. And during that open enrollment period is when you buy your policies for the following year. So we just closed that open enrollment period a couple of weeks ago for the 2026 policy years. Those rates are already baked in. So if we were to extend those credits, the rates are already baked in unless we go to extraordinary measures of allowing the payers to once again refile their rates and then having another open enrollment period, which I would guess would be March or April by the time you got all that through. And so then what do you do with that? Make those rates ex post facto, have them go back to the beginning of the year, or do you allow it to go through its normal cycle, in which case those rates affect the 2027 year? So the point that I'm making is by extending those Obamacare subsidies, you're not affecting the 2026 rates without going to extraordinary measures to unroll everything that's already happened. And so what will happen is those insurance companies that filed higher rates with the assumption of those premium tax credits staying in will get the benefit of having a higher rate plus having that tax credit. Going back to how I started this fraud was put onto the American people to hide the taxes so that the American people weren't taxed directly. They taxed the insurance companies that are getting these tax credits to change those rates for the people. This is not going to affect what's happening right now without extraordinary measures. What we need to do in closing, and I thank you to my colleague from Florida for allowing me to speak here, what we need to do is we need to start looking at alternatives on what are the core drivers of the cost of health insurance. How do we rate insurance so that younger, healthier people are still willing to pay for it? So we have spread risk there. What are the things that we can look at for driving costs down to stopping this endless cycle of adverse selection so that people can actually, as was promised on this big fraud perpetrated on the American people, have the doctor they want, the plan they want, and have their rates going down. And this Obamacare premium debacle is not the answer, but we do need to get to work and figure out how we can get to the root causes of these rising prices. Because, as I said, this is either going to collapse under its own weight, or we're going to be forced to write an unlimited check from the federal government, which me and many of my colleagues are unwilling to do. And with that, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Herodopoulos, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you very much.